Hi, today I'm going to be covering how to get videos to open at the correct size in Xmonad, how to rename your workspaces, get your terminal to show the application that's actually running instead of just the terminal name, and a couple of other things. So first of all, what I'm going to do is switch to desktop and switch to tiled mode and open a video. Normally what happens is when you open a video, see, I've got this set by default to open as a floating window, but if I pop this back into the stack, which by default would be the mod key and T, but I've rebound to shift mod and T, you'll see what happens. Normally what would happen is this window would actually appear in the center of the screen down here with big black borders. If I move this across to the right screen, you'll see again it's perfectly positioned on the right. I can open windows, let me just switch and open a couple of windows, and then you see as I move this up, the video window is scaled to the correct size without any borders, and this is done using the hints library from xmonad, and I'll show you how to do that. So if I come across to my configuration file, there is I think it's the layout hints we need to import. So we import layout hints, and then if we come down to our layout section, well, first of all we need to come down to our main. If I come down to my main, what you need to do is add this section to your main. Handle event hook, my event hook, handle event hook, desktop config. And desktop config corresponds to the name of your desktop config up here. So what is handle event hook, my event hook, handle event hook, desktop config. And that is going to correspond, this is going to be used actually with the layout up here. You can see the tiled layout. I'll cover this renamed replace in a second. This layout hints with placements, and then the layout, you know, in I forget what the brackets, braces, whatever, here. So what we have is layouts with placement, and this 1.0 comma 0.0 is what actually sets it. This is like an XY coordinates, and this basically sets it so that it's always going to be at the top and on the shifted to the right. So that basically sets it so that the tiling layout will respect hints from a Windows program on how to position the window. So MPV gives hints about the size of the window, and adding this will let the tiling layout respect that so that the video shows at the correct size. So that's how we set the layouts with placement, and that again is if I close the window here and open that, put it into tiling mode, you can see as I shift the video across, it automatically scales without any borders and is always at the top of the screen, not in the middle of the screen, which makes for a much nicer way to view a video. So that's basically how you can set a video to open at the correct size in a specific layout. So the next thing I want to cover is using the renamed library. So if I come up to my config and have a look here, yeah, under layout, import xmonad layout rename, replace. And basically what this will allow us to do is rename our workspaces, and I'll explain why that's important. Our layouts. So you can see here I've got my layouts defined as like full tiled grid, but what happens is, for instance, when you apply a a library like spaced to a layout, the name of the layout changes. So for instance, if I had grid, by default it's going to be called grid, but if I add the spacing library to the grid layout, the name of the layout, I've switched to grid mode here, will actually change to spacing grid. And the reason this is an issue is because I'll show you up here in my keys, or down here in my keys rather, I have jump to layout defined, which lets me jump to a particular layout with a keyboard shortcut. And the problem is that if you change the layout by adding different actions or modifiers, you know, like spacing, it's going to change the name. So what will happen is every time you change the layout by adding different things like resizable tool or what have you, the name of the layout is going to change, so your key bindings are going to stop working. So you'd either have to put in jump to layout hinted spacing resizable tool or something, but instead of that, what we do is we come down, or go back up rather, to the layouts, and we can actually rename the layouts by doing this. So up here we have the name of the layout, so avoid strut, so all these layouts are avoiding struts. So we've got full tiled grid BSP. Basically then what we do is tiled equals renamed, and we say replace and put in the name we want, and basically that will replace the default name that's being created by xmonad with one that you specify. So again, instead of having a long-winded name, like say basically this name would be hints spacing resizable tool, or this would be spacing grid. So by using this renamed function, it actually simplifies things when it comes to key bindings. And also the other thing is, instead of having a big long workspace name up here, you just have a very simple name. So I can switch tool, grid, BSP, full. So instead of having a big long name that takes up a lot of space in your bar up here and it's not easy to identify, this simplifies it and makes it easier to use your key bindings. So that was the second thing I wanted to go through, is how to rename your workspaces with the rename function, so that you know, it's more aesthetically pleasing and easier to work with your key bindings. Now the next thing I want to cover is actually setting your terminal's name for Windows. So I'll show you what I mean. If I close this window over here, if you can see up here, the window name is zsh tilde. Now normally what would happen is this would show urxvt, which is the name of my terminal. But if you watch, every time I execute a command, it's actually changing the window's name. So if I open, for instance, Newsboat, you can see that the name of the window is now Newsboat. And the reason why this is important is because a couple of reasons. It then allows you to send particular windows with a window name to a different workspace by default, for instance. So you know, any program you've opened in the terminal, Newsboat, WeChat or something like that, by setting the window name, it then allows you to you know, position it automatically. Whereas if you didn't have this set up, your window name would just always be the name of the terminal. So I'll show you again, ncmpc, switch to that, w3m-b, we can see the name of the Windows changed there. So it will actually show the complete name of the command that is actually running in the terminal. So top And the way we do this on the zsh shell is actually quite easy. If I come down to the bottom of the zsh file here, there is a bit of code I found on Stack Overflow, which basically is a case statement, and this checks if you're what kind of terminal you're running. And if you're running a different terminal than xterminal or urxvt, you would need to put in a pipe and then the name of the application. And then basically what this does, it has a pre-command and a execute a command that is run after the first command. And basically what this does is this sets the window name to the application that you've launched, and then when you quit it, it resets it back to whatever working directory you're currently in. So this bit of code basically changes the name of the terminal title, which then allows you to have different sort of actions on that window. And the other thing is, if I open this window now and I open up Rofi, I'll switch to another workspace. If I open up Rofi, I think it's actually showing, it's still showing the desktop. It should show, there we go. I'm on scratchpad window 1, sorry, newsboat. Here you can see basically what we got here, window 4, this is where I'm running ffmpeg. And by default you can see it's showing the window name, the application, and the window title. So by default, normally it would just show urxvt, and you wouldn't be able to see which application was running on which workspace. But by enabling this bit of code in your zshrc file, it will then display the application as a name in Rofi there. So there is probably similar functions for your bash rc file or something, but you'd have to search around for them. And if you're using something like myZSH, you're going to have to look into how you replicate this functionality with that program. And I'll just have some tea. So that's how we can set the terminals window to show the title of the application that is actually running. And after you've made those changes to your zshrc file, you'd run source.zsh /.zshrc to pick up the changes, and then you would then have this in your xmobile showing the name of the application that's running rather than just the terminal name. So the other thing that I wanted to cover was setting up a scratchpad. Basically, a scratchpad is like a window that you can bring up and dismiss, which can be running any other program you want. And basically, I've just set this up to open a terminal. So if I press mod controls and enter, you can see it's opened this new window here. It's called scratchpad. That's a terminal. If I switch across, you can see this is a regular terminal. So if I, for instance, put newsboat in there, if I then press the keyboard shortcut, you can see it disappears. And by default, I've got this set to be a non-floating window. So what that means is if I switch into a full screen mode and I execute the keyboard shortcut, it's going to come up in full screen mode. Whereas if I'm in tool mode, a master stack, it will behave like that, or grid or BSP. I haven't got lots of windows open on that one, but if I come back across to here and bring the terminal back, I'll show you the way that I'm using this and the reason why I'm doing that. Let me shift this across to workspace 1, and this is the scratchpad. I'm just going to move this across. Now, quite often I like to browse like this with a web browser here, you know, maybe a text editor here, and a video up here. Now if I open a video, I'll show you what the problem is and why the scratchpad's a useful solution. So I'm going to open that and then put that into the stack. Now you can see I've got the video here, but I also have the terminal window that I use to launch MPV, which I don't really need, and it's taking a lot of space up in the stack. Now you can see this is the scratchpad, so what I can do is I can fetch the scratchpad shortcut key and hide the scratchpad. What that allows me to do is I can still play the video. You know, I can still play the video. I don't need to be seeing this window here with the on-screen display. That's not actually, that's just taking up workspace. So I can hide that and still play the video, and then that allows me to have extra space down here for a text editor, for instance, so that, you know, I can, you know, browse stuff, do some coding, watch a video. So that's why I think the scratchpad is quite useful for that sort of thing, because you can just bring it across, do that, and then, you know, hide it. So it's very useful to play videos that way, because it hides the terminal window that you've launched MPV with. It's also very good, if I quit that, for instance, I'll put that back onto there, and open I'll switch to full screen mode. You know, maybe you want to listen to some music, perhaps some AC/DC, and having this, what you can do is just have this drop down sort of Quake. When it's in full screen, it'll be like a full screen Quake terminal that comes down, or if you're in another mode, what will happen is it will just come up here like so. So that's really handy, and you can define lots of scratch pads. So what I'll do is now show you how to define the scratch pad in xmonad. So let's look at how you can set up a named scratch pad on xmonad. If I come into my xmonad config, you'll see that I've imported the named scratchpad library. So that's xmonad util named scratchpad. And then there's a couple of things you need to do to actually set this up. In your myManageHook, you actually need name scratchpad manage hook and then the name of the scratch pads that you're defining. And you also need to set some keys, which I'll come on to into a second. But if you come across down here, you'll see I've created these scratch pads, and basically I've copied this config from DT's xmonad config. So if you search for distrotube GitLab, GitLab, and come across to Derek Taylor's .files and down to xmonad, and right down the bottom is where he's defined some workspaces, not workspaces, the scratch pads. So this is how he's defining his scratch pads, and basically what he's doing is creating a custom floating window of a specific size. So if that's your thing, you can do that, and he's got a video on YouTube about how he does that. But I'm just setting mine up as a non-floating window. So first of all, what we have here is the name of the scratch pad we're defining, and these three variables. And this is my terminal, which is a variable that I've defined and set to urxvt. And then this bit here is urxvt specific. This is how you set the name of a window in urxvt. So what this is going to do is launch urxvt with the -name option and set the name of the terminal window to scratchpad. And then what this allows us to do is use that variable name to find the window with that name, because otherwise we don't want it just affecting any urxvt terminal window. It's got to be the specific one we want. And this is managed term non-floating. So this is where you could specify different attributes for the window. As I say down here, DT has got his set as a custom floating window using the rational rect library, which allows you to set the position and size of the window. But I wanted mine as a non-floating window so that it can be popped in and out of the stack. So this is how we define the terminal scratchpad name, these three variables, which then affect the name of the window that's created and its position and layout. And what you need to do is actually in your sort of config, your variables, you can see I've got my terminal set to urxvtc, and that's because in my startup hook I'm launching urxvtd as the daemon in the background. So you need to set your terminal and you need to set your keys. Excuse me. So this is the key basically that I've sort of defined to launch and hide the scratchpad, and that's the mod key, which is going to be by default alt, but if you changed it to mod 4 mask, that would be the super key. So that would be the super key, Windows key, command key on the Mac, control and return, and then that basically toggles the terminal. And as you can see, if it will, because it's a non-floating window, it's going to fit in with the stack. And that's just basically the way I wanted it. But if you don't want that, then you can change how the window displays. So that's how you can set a scratchpad and a keyboard shortcut to launch it. So again, that was importing the scratchpad library, the name scratchpad. Then in your myStartupHook, name scratchpad, name scratchpad manage hook, and then scratchpads, which is the name of scratchpads I've defined. And then again, we define the application we're going to be running in the scratchpad and how it's launched. And remember, my terminal is a variable we've set to our terminal, and then again we basically set the keys that we're going to use to launch the scratchpad, like so. So those are a couple of things that I wanted to go over in xmonad, and that was basically how we can set a video to have the correct position. So if I put this back into the stack by the default key binding to pop a floating window back into the stack is the mod key and T, but I've got it bound to shift mod and T, and you can see how this window isn't centered with black bars, which makes it more difficult to actually view the video if it's down here. So it's much nicer to have the window up there, and you see it's resizing here. And again, what I did was if I quit that and close this window and then bring up the name scratchpad, close that, and show you how I'm sort of using the name scratchpad. If I move that across and up, and bear with me while I pull the windows about a bit. Right, got there eventually. So having the name scratchpad launch a video is handy, because then you can hide the terminal that you've used to launch the video with. And then, for instance, if I wanted to move Emacs across here, move that down. It's much nicer to have, and we move Firefox across again. Let's move Firefox across and kill that window. It's much nicer to have this kind of layout with video, a browser, your text editor, as opposed to, if I select this and then bring up the scratchpad again, having the terminal that's launched the video, because then you'll have a smaller stack area for your windows, and we don't need this window at all. And the thing is, you can't, you obviously you can't quit this window, because that would quit the video. So being able to remove the window from the stack using a scratchpad is really useful. So if I come across and then I shift these windows back, shift that one back and come across here. So that was how we can set a video to have a sort of default, respect the default size of the video. And if I basically come across, how we did that was the LayoutHints library, and basically if I come down into my layouts, you can see layouts, hints with placement, and that was basically, this basically sets the X and Y position of the video, so that it's always at the top, and if it's in the right, it's going to move the video to the right of the window. So when the video sort of pops up and is resized, it's always going to be in the right, so it's nicely positioned. So that's the layout hints with placement. And the other thing that we did was we used the renamed library to rename the layout names. So again, what we did was we came into renamed down here, import xmonad layout, renamed, replace. And again, what this allows us to do is, if I come down into the layout, we have the layout here with the names of the layouts, and we're using equals, renamed, replace, and then the $sign, and then the actual layout. And again, what this does is, for instance, the tiled layout, if I didn't rename it, it would be called hint spacing resizable tool, something like that. It's a big long name, and so by doing this we can shorten that name to just like tool, which is easier to read, but also when you're doing your keyboard shortcuts, which I think are down here, again with the jump to layout, you have to define the name of the layout you're jumping to, and when you add particular modifiers and actions to a layout, it actually changes the name of the layout as it's displayed in your xmo bar. And so for instance, if you defined one called grid, a keyboard shortcut for grid to jump to the grid layout, and you add spacing to it, that will then rename the layout to spacing grid. So you'd either have to keep changing the names, these variable names here, so that they're correct with the layout that you've defined. So you're playing around, you're adding different libraries, spacing or hinting or whatever, and every time you restart the restart xmonad to pick up the changes, your keyboard shortcuts would stop working because the names don't match. So doing this ensures that whenever you alter your layout by adding modifiers or actions, that your keyboard shortcuts will still work. So that's how you set up renames. The other thing I was going to mention is spacing. You can see this section here, spacing true border, this true border here. Normally what most people do is they put spacing, you know, like 12 or something, but what that does is that basically means that the spacing between the two windows in the center is multiplied, so it's 12 and 12, so you get a bigger gap. So what this does is, if I shift to the tool mode and add some windows, basically what it's doing is it's specifying the size, the border sizes for sort of the screen in the next window. So it sort of sets the border, sort of the padding, you know, the margin around here and around here, so that they have the spacing is equal. If I sort of open a few windows, you can see that sort of the spacing is sort of equal. Obviously you have sort of occasions where you're opening windows here and it's not going to sort of exactly match up there, because all the windows in the stack are going to be different sizes, so you shouldn't get too hung up on the fact that, my god, my windows aren't matching up. That's just a petty thing. But this is how we can add spacing and ensure the spacing is consistent between the center and the next size, so that the gaps aren't sort of doubled up. So that's how we can sort of set the spacing here between the windows. If I come across and I've applied the same setting to grid, I switch to grid mode here, you can see more clearly what I mean, that it's an exact sort of spacing, as opposed to sort of, if you just set the spacing to like 4 or 12 or whatever, what happens is it kind of multiplies those settings between the two sides, and you get an extra large gap. So this ensures that the spacing is correct. And the other thing that we did was set the terminal's window to actually have the application's name that is running in it. So if I come across and close some of these windows and wait for the helicopter to go past, which for some reason always comes around all the time, I don't know if it's Barrett's or something, but if I open an application here, you'll see that the xmobile is actually saying Newsboat, which is the name of the application I've opened, instead of just urxvt, which would be the name of the terminal application I'm using. And that if I come across and open Rofi, which is the application launcher and window switcher, you'll actually see here on the first window, window 1, urxvt Newsboat. So instead of just saying urxvt, it actually tells you what the application is, because if you've got lots of terminal windows open across different workspaces and you're using a window switcher and you're trying to get an overview of what's where, if they're all just called urxvt, it's not terribly helpful. Whereas if it's actually telling you the name of the application that's running, it makes it much easier to switch and see what's happening. And so again, if you see here, every time I execute a command, it's actually going to change the window name to the command that is actually running. So again, like top, for instance, and we did that in our zsh RC file, zshrc file, zsh file. Yeah, it is RC file. So yeah, this was the block of code that I found on Stack Overflow that basically is a case statement, and if you're running a different terminal, whack the name in there, and this is specifically for ZSH. If you're running a different shell, you have to look this up. But basically, it has a pre-command and a command that finishes after the command's done, so it switches the Windows name back from the command that was running, as it were. So if I open a command there, you can see it's NTMPC. If I quit it, it switches back to the previous command that had been run, which in this case is the name of the directory that I'm in. And again, this is useful because in your xmonad.hs file, you have the manage hook, and this allows you to move applications to different workspaces, float them, don't float them, based on their window name. But this only works if you can actually set the window name of the thing you're running. If we didn't do this, you wouldn't be able to specify, okay, I always want Newsboat to be on Workspace 5 or WeChat or any other program that you're running in the terminal. This will then allow you to use your myManageHook to set that window to always be displayed on a particular workspace or something. So that's why setting the window name of the terminal is helpful, because one, you can see what's going on when you're switching windows, and in the actual xmonad status showing what's running, but also it allows you to then manipulate that window and move it to different workspaces or float it as you wish. So that's basically how we set up a couple of things. The floating the video window so it's the correct size with the layout hints, which was up again here. So we had the layout hints, and we imported the layout renamed to rename workspaces, and the named scratchpad. And again, you need to make sure to define my terminal, which we use with my scratchpad, and also we have to set my event hook equals hints event hook for the window hinting, which is how we set the video to open at the correct size. So the my event hook equals hints event hook, and that needs to be specified in the main config. So handle event hook, my event hook, this section down here basically, and it's going to be like this, and then that will pick up the that event hook. And what that does is it allows the hinting, the hinting is how it hints at the right size of the window to take place instantaneously when you're sort of switching layouts. So it's kind of like a hook that happens when you're switching layouts. It then checks the sort of the position and stuff of the window and sort of makes sure it's scaled properly. So that's how you set the handle event hook. And for the scratch pads, what you needed to do was set the my scratch pad manage hooks hook, and then the name of the scratch pads, which was down here again with my terminal, which is the variable defined for the terminal, and these are the options that basically set the terminal name. So this is your urxvt specific, this name name option. If you're using the terminal, you're going to have to look up the option in the man page that allows you to set the terminal window. But if I switch to tile grid and then bring the terminal up, you can see that the title of the terminal window is set to scratchpad, which is how it how the key bindings work to automatically find the window with that name and sort of toggle it being visible and hidden. And you will also notice up here this NSP, this is the name scratchpad. And interestingly, if you're using the Rofi application launcher window switcher, which I'll bring up, you'll see that the name scratchpad is actually listed amongst the windows, so I can actually switch to the name scratchpad. So if I do that, if I switch to the NSP name scratchpad, you'll see that's selected now, and you actually need to, because it's the keyboard shortcut doesn't work if you select it from Rofi like this. You need to bring up Rofi again and then sort of select switch to, you know, the third window or something. If I can get this to come away now. Why is it launching Blender? I didn't mean to that. So let me just quit Blender and see if I can switch to the switch back to Firefox or something. Okay, there we go. And so that was just a weird thing with Rofi. Just I wanted to come across that if you actually select the name scratchpad from within Rofi, it can be tricky to get out of it again. And you got to select another workspace from within Rofi to sort of get out of the name scratchpad. So that was one issue I just sort of came across using Rofi and the name scratchpad. So those are a couple of things that I wanted to go through, which was the layout hints, the renaming, the spacing, setting the terminal window application as name, so that, you know, basically it shows the you know, name of the app that's, you know, running up here. Newsboat. If I'm any sort of, you know, program that's going to run there, you can see it's using a lot of memory for Xorg and FFmpeg. But you can see the name of the window changes to reflect the command that you're actually running in the terminal, which is then useful because, as I say, you can then manipulate that window using the manage hooks section, my manage hook section in your xmonad config, to actually move it to different workspace, float it, or manipulate it in different ways, which you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. And if you're not running ZSH, you're going to need to have a little search around for the settings that will let you change the window name in the terminal that you're using. But that was a couple of things I wanted to go over, and I can't think of any other things offhand to say. This was the ZSH settings that I found on Stack Overflow, which is the case statement to change the name of the window, and all the settings in the my xmonad configuration file, which I'll put a link to under the video. So that's a couple of things on xmonad, how to hint windows on different layouts. Again, you can apply the layout hinting to different layouts, but I thought it only really made sense in the tiled layout, because there's no point putting it in the full screen, because it's full screen, not going to do anything. And the grid and BSP layouts are setting windows to a specific size anyway, so putting the layout hints with placements in those isn't really going to do anything. So it's only kind of really something you do in a sort of master and stack layout. And again, the setting the spacing raw, that's how we set the correct spacing between the windows and the screen again. So if I just come back to grid mode and just open some windows, you can see they're all equally spaced. Switch to tiled. You can see the spacing here and here is the same. So doing that, if I come across setting the spacing like that, which is the recommended way, if you have a look at the package instructions, as opposed to just putting in spacing 12 or 4 or 8, will sort of ensure more consistent spacing. So that's the spacing and the renaming to rename the workspace title layout titles, which is nicer to look at rather than big long names and helps with the keyboard shortcuts. So I think that's most of the things I wanted to cover, and I'll put the links to the code under the video.